This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, the subject is Davey and Goliath, the 1960s and 70s claymation show, and the conversation will begin in a moment. Tim Frakes is my guest. We will be talking about the claymation show Davey and Goliath. Like I like to do with all of my guests, I want to give them a few minutes to introduce themselves. So welcome, Tim. My first two questions before you answer, I guess you've probably heard this before. You're not related to the guy from Star Trek, Jonathan Frakes, are you?
Somewhere down the line,
Oh, yeah?
but no direct relation. No.
Okay. And also, before we just get into your background, it was a hell of a hard time finding anyone who'd even written about Davey and Goliath. The few people who had done little videos of it were either dead or just missing. It's just interesting how quickly things disappear in our society because Davey and Goliath was fairly big. I grew up in the New York City area. It was on every Saturday and Sunday morning, repeated ad nauseum. But let me just ask a little bit about your background then, because I did find you having written about the Davey and Goliath show. So who are you and what do you do?
Well, my name is Tim Frakes. I produce documentary and live event video for nonprofit, faith-based broadcast and corporate clients, kind of in that order. I'm based in the Chicago area. For 14 years prior to starting my business in 2007, I was the principal videographer for the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, which is based in Chicago. Its church-wide office is in Chicago. And in that capacity, I produced a video magazine program called Mosaic, the video magazine of the ELCA. And as part of that documentary series, it was distributed throughout the ELCA, initially on VHS and then DVD in the later years. But as part of that program, we did a story on Davey and Goliath. Davey and Goliath was produced by the Lutheran Church in America, and the Lutheran Church in America, or the LCA, was a predecessor body of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. In 1987, three Lutheran denominations merged into one church body, the ALC, the American Lutheran Church, the LCA, and the AELC. It's an alphabet soup. But those three denominations merged into one, forming the ELCA in 1987, and that is who I worked for, the ELCA. Prior to my time, of course, Davey and Goliath was produced out of New York through the Office of Communication, I believe is what it was called. A gentleman by the name of R. Marshall Strauss was the executive in charge of it, and they were aware of a very popular show on television at the time, Gumby, and they wanted to do a children's program, and so the head of the bishop of the Lutheran Church in America saw the value of television as a medium of communication. The evangelical part of American Christianity was embraced the electronic church early on, from the days of Amy Semple McPherson in Los Angeles through Billy Sunday and all the early radio broadcasts. The evangelical church was just on it. And they by the 1950s, they were essentially becoming the dominant power in the medium. And there was an important event in legislation that told broadcasters through the FCC, you no longer are compelled to carry religious programming and pay for it. And this was a real shock to the mainline church. and so the evangelicals said, "Well, heck, we'll pay for it," and they did. People like Pat Robertson came along, and Jim Baker, and Jimmy Swaggart, and so on. But for the mainline folks, they had been getting airtime for free nationally, and so they got the guy that created Gumby, a guy by the name of Art Clokey, and he agreed to, he and his wife, Ruth Goodell Clokey, they had a studio out in San Rafael, California, and they came to an agreement and agreed to produce the program. It was not, by the way, claymation. That's a common misnomer. It was animatronics is what is the term that Art used. Okay. And that is claymation. You take literally mud and you form it into a figure, and then you move the figure. It's malleable. But animatronics, they were literally puppets that were built with a metal skeleton, and then they had fabric over the top of them. So they were sort of little robots, if you can think of it that way. But you had to manipulate them by hand. And it was very popular, but then the FCC came along with this new ruling, and it wiped out the capacity for mainline denominations to get free time in broadcasting, and that was the end of Davey and Goliath, because there's no way that the Lutheran Church in America could buy time on commercial stations, for a weekly program.
So, what is this waiting in the lobby? Get rid of this here. So let me just talk a little bit, well, if we can, since you worked for the church, just explain a little bit. Obviously, Lutherans were formed by Martin Luther. I grew up raised as a Lutheran, St. John's Evangelical Lutheran Church in Glendale in New York City. Pastor Martin Stagey was my pastor when I was a little boy. I used to argue with him all the time about this doesn't make sense, or this, that, well, I don't understand. But he was a good man, and it's interesting because over the years I found out that the Missouri Synod, of which our church was part of, was supposed to be very conservative. But in New York City, I have to say, it wasn't conservative, even though it said evangelical. The later idea of people have praise Jesus, it wasn't there. It was very reserved. It was very much a very simple, not quite Calvinism, I would say, but heading towards Calvinism. Can you maybe just briefly explain what a synod is and what the evangelical versus the non-evangelical Lutherans are, if you can?
Right. The story of Lutherans in America is the story of immigration. So the Germans come in the 17th and 18th century, the Danes, the Norwegians in the 19th century. And so what Lutheran flavor you were depended on your ethnicity. And these ethnic groups formed into collectives that they, for common benefit, they formed fraternal organizations, colleges, universities, schools, those kinds of things. And their worship was often in the language of their immigrant background. So you had German churches, and you would have had those in New York and so on. But as the decades and even centuries moved on, ethnicity became less of a distinctive. And by the 20th century, Lutheranism in America began to divide over cultural issues, not so much theology as cultural issues. So if you can put yourself in the place of the time of Davey and Goliath, prior to the 1960s, in the late 1950s, there was a uniformity. There was a cohesiveness of American culture post-World War II. And for Lutherans, when that began to shatter in the 1960s, they found themselves needing to pick a side, kind of like things are today, and so some Lutherans tended to be culturally more inclusive, and others more exclusive, and I think that tends to explain a little bit why the Missouri Synod is often perceived as being more conservative, and the ELCA or its predecessor bodies were more progressive or open or liberal. Big distinctives are, can women be ordained, for example? That's a big divider. But it has to do more, well, depends on who you ask, whether it's theological or cultural. But
well, it's
so
interesting.
that's a big part of it. But your experience in New York, yes, the Missouri Synod, it was, what was the synod called? A synod, by the way, is it's just a group. It's just a way of, a diocese, if you were going to be Roman Catholic about it. So the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod was a synod of like-minded Lutherans in the Midwest, itself made up of a merger of different German groups and a few other ethnicities that really held to their confessions. They really wanted to out-Lutheran, the Lutheran sort of. And the other groups tended to be much more ecumenical. They were interested in, there was a big movement around the turn of the 20th century towards Christian unity. Those more progressive Lutheran churches really gravitated towards that. And you saw a lot of mergers of different ethnic Lutheran groups into larger and larger groups, eventually forming the ALC and the LCA, which eventually merged to form the ELCA.
Yeah, when you mentioned the ethnic component of it, my church was just a couple blocks away from a large park, and they would often be involved in the local Oktoberfests there, which is a German holiday during that month. And it was interesting too, because I went for a few years to the school before the St. John's School, elementary school, before it got too expensive for my parents. And there was at the time some black and Hispanic kids, just a handful that were being let in, even though some of them, one of my best friends was a black kid who was actually a Roman Catholic. I didn't know until years later. I just assumed he was Lutheran. So it was the whole Davey and Goliath thing was very applicable to my growing up in the late 60s and early 70s, because Davey had a black friend, he had a Latino friend at the time. This is in the 1960s when, you wouldn't see that.
Davey and Goliath was very intentional and very, very progressive for the time. They worked long and hard to make sure that those scripts were inclusive. When they saw themselves, when they became aware that they were being exclusionary, they addressed it in future programs. Mm-hmm. They just really, really worked hard. And I interviewed a number of the people that were directly involved, including Art, his spouse, Ruth, his son, who later went on to sort of inherit the franchise, and the producers and so on, and they bent over backwards to try to be inclusive, and that was so far out in front of the curve. It really is obvious if you look back at it today and then compare it with what was going on.
Yeah.
But really, Art Clokey's vision of the world was a very progressive, loving kind of view. He was not a Christian, which is interesting, but he did love children. He and Ruth did, and they wanted programming that was clean, that was wholesome, that was positive, and I think that's what attracted the LCA to Art in the first place.
It's interesting because there were only like 70 or so episodes produced, including a few holiday specials. Mostly it was several seasons of 13, and you can divide them between the 60s, the first 3 seasons, and then the early 70s, the last 2 seasons, plus a few of those specials. But the thing that I found interesting is, despite when people talk about Davey and Goliath, which they rarely do, or when it's parodied, it's always seen as super square. It makes the Brady Bunch look like a bunch of degenerates, But in looking at it, it's actually not nearly as quote unquote square as it seems to be, because throughout the 5 seasons, the 60s to the 70s, there are a number of episodes where Davey is a little bastard. You know, he opens up a show and he's calling his sister a dummy. He's berating Goliath. I hate you. Get out of my sight. He back talks to his parents. I mean, yes, he's not pulling out. He's not selling drugs and he's not pulling out a switchblade, but he's quite the teen or the preteen or whatever he would be child for that era.
Well, they also address big issues, you know. In the big Easter special, Davey's grandmother dies, mm-hmm. and so they're talking to children about death and dying. You know, it's interesting you mention it. I think many of us, myself included, tended to look at Mr. Rogers as being square somehow, and now in hindsight, we look back at it and go, "My God, this guy was profound in his insight about how children think," and you know, and I think Davey kind of shared some of that.
Let me just talk a little bit though before we talk about some of the episodes that really stood out to me, and any that you want to talk about. Let me just talk a little bit about the animatronics, because in the two eras, the early '60s, then they broke for 5 or 6 years, in the early '70s, several things happened. One, I don't know if it's visually, there's a gauzy look to the early Davies, and the mouths don't sync up quite as well. They're just like sometimes perfect O's or one. But you fast forward just a few years, and not only did the subject matter get more overtly political in the Vietnam era there, but it seems to take a leap upward technologically. Was Clokey after the first 3 seasons, then the sort of interim? Did Clokey want to come back and better himself? Because it seems like he found better materials or better systems to make it a little more realistic.
I can't speak to the technological differences between the 60s and 70s because I wasn't there. I can tell you that Art told me that they really had a tough time with water. So Davey's in a fishing boat. How do you get water to animate?
Yeah,
that was a real tough one that they struggled with. They had a production line. They had tables that were set up kind of like people that are into trains. You know, they build model trains, and so you have this little studio set up.
Yeah.
And I think they just got better over time because it became like a factory. You know, and you had the puppets were already made, and you didn't have to start from scratch. So I think they probably just got better at what they did, like any craft, you know. But there were attempts in the 2000s to revive Davey, and I'm going to refer you to my boss and friend Eric Schaefer. I'll give you his contact afterwards.
Okay.
And Eric was the head of communication for the ELCA during my tenure. And Eric and Christy Bangert, another staff member, were instrumental in reviving Davey. And when they did one called Snowboard Christmas. Art was long gone by then, and his son was involved in the production. And that was done not with animatronics, but with more modern digital tools, many more digital tools than were available in the 60s and 70s. So there's a definite jump in the Snowboard Christmas episode that was produced in the 2000s. But in terms of how they got better in the 60s and 70s, I couldn't speak.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, the 60s shows not only, Davey seems to be younger. He and his sister Sally seem to, I guess I would say that they're 6, 7, 8-year-olds then. In the later show, they're probably 10, 11, 12-year-olds, as they've aged a few years. Not the actual number of years between the two series, but looking at the first season, there's a lot of interpersonal relationships that are explored. For example, there's one called The Wild Goat, where the family is out on a day trip and they find an injured little goat and they nurse him back to health, and Davey wants to keep him, but he has to let the goat go back to be a goat, being wild. And as someone who's always had pets, or not in that era, but for most of my life I've had pets, that's a very difficult thing and a topic, because you do lose pets through death. They sometimes run away, or you do have the situation where Davey does that, and I think that one was handled very well. And then there's another one where he's visited by his cousin Barney, who's a smaller child than even his younger sister, and the kid does nothing but get in trouble. And so there's no inherent drama to these little shows, but they do show how how you deal with the loss of a pet, how you deal with an unpleasant or not particular a relative you're not particularly fond of. And was there a specific focus in the early 3 seasons on these interpersonal relationships that later we then sort of expand out to the world and its problems?
Throughout the life of Davey and Goliath, the Lutheran Church in America was instrumental in coming up with the story concepts. They wanted to make sure that what was broadcast was in line with Lutheran theology, primarily the idea of grace, that we are loved regardless of whether we're good or bad. Mm-hmm. That you can't be good enough, that God is a loving God. They really were certain about that. So they would come up with these ideas, and then Art would develop the scripts, and they go back and forth, and much attention. They spent, I think, the LCA initially put $1 million into Davey. That was in the late 50s. That was a lot of money.
Yeah.
There's no way the Lutheran Church today, the ELCA, could put up the equivalent amount of money in today's dollars to do that production. So they were keenly aware of it, that it was reaching a wide audience, and they really were insistent on certain ideas and themes and concepts. How Art executed that was left up to Art. He was and so they just went back and forth.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because I'm looking now at the second season, and there's an episode called Officer Bob. And this is one of the things that with episodic television that has seemingly gone away. Everything seems to be a soap opera, a serial now. But Officer Bob is actually Officer Dan through the rest of the series. It's the same character, the same doll. I think maybe the hat is a little different. And similarly, in the early episodes, you get Davey has a black friend and a Latino friend, and they reappear in the later 2 seasons, but with totally different names, as if they never existed.
Well, you got to make a new puppet, right?
Yeah, I guess. But the Officer Bob one, and there's also Down on the Farm. These are 2 episodes, just looking at them, where Davey is given good, solid advice. He's either too lazy or too self-involved to follow the advice. Exactly what he was warned against by the adults happens, and he learns his lesson. Now, a lot of people would say, well, this is just overly didactic, and I guess if you're watching it several times, it isn't. But if you're a child and you're watching it for the first time, you will have had these experiences. It may not be a police officer, it may be your pastor, it may be your teacher, it may be your Uncle Sid, but you will have that same advice. In the Down on the Farm one, Davey lets his grandpa's prized vegetables go to rot because he doesn't spray bug spray.
Well, you just got to keep in mind that as they were producing these, front and center was the civil rights movement, was Vietnam emerging, was the whole student movement. Culture was changing, music was changing, hair length was changing. Everything was, the old order was being swept away, and the church was trying to find a way to address that. And so that ethos, those ideas were forefront in their minds. They were trying to be relevant in their communication.
Now, in the 3rd season, probably for me, the episode that sort of presaged what would come in the later couple of seasons was an episode called The Jickets, which had reappeared several times in earlier episodes, where Davey and his best friend are in a gang. And like the Our Gang comedies before them, they build this clubhouse. And for I don't remember the reason. I saw this a few weeks ago. The then president of the Jickets, not Davey, but one of his friends, all of a sudden gets this idea, oh, there's a new kid in the neighborhood, let's beat the hell out of him. And they try to do that, and Davey again has to stand up for what's right, even after initially going along with it. And it's one of those things too, that on the surface seems like a very standard episode. It's something very much like, I think there was an episode on bullying with the Brady Bunch, which I mentioned earlier, and standing up to bullies. But the episode also isn't just about standing up to bullies. It's about trying to find non-violent ways to resolve something. Davey tries to talk it out before they fight, and then eventually sometimes you do have to use your fists.
I'm thinking of R. Marshall Strauss, the church executive that was overall in charge of Davey, and if he were with us today and he was listening to your comments, he would have a big smile on his face. Totally buttoned down dude with a bow tie, he was a very classy kind of guy, but he would just smile because that is exactly what they were doing. Yeah. They didn't want to make Davey wooden or one-dimensional.
Yeah.
They wanted the problems that he experienced to be real, and I think that's reflective, that he didn't always make the right choice. Yet, in the end, he is forgiven for his mistakes and learns from them and moves forward.
And there's a couple of episodes in the later series I want to talk about too, but why was there the 6 or 7 year gap in production? Did the first 3 years, because they played endlessly, was there a demand for more Davies?
Oh yeah, it got really popular. I couldn't speak to the the Nielsen's, or I don't even think, because they were distributed through the network, but it was up to local stations whether they wanted to play it or not. And so what would happen is they would get local churches to call the local station and lobby for it. But I think probably just budget was the reason, not because of popularity. But that's a good question. I'm reluctant to say definitively. I don't know why they had a gap, but I'm thinking it was budget.
So when it comes back in the early 70s, there is a definite shift in tone, as we mentioned before. Davey and his friends seem to be 4 or 5 years older. I'm not sure if Davey by this time or his friends like girls yet. I guess they would be considered pre-pubertal or pre-teens now, or tweens, and it is more outward looking. There's an episode where Davey and his friends go to the inner city, because Davey lives in a perpetual suburb. They go to the inner city to rehab a park that's fallen into disrepair, and they get all the neighbors to help and whatnot. There's an episode where his new black friend has a cousin who's blind and doesn't like white people, and then his friend has Davey escort his cousin around, and when the cousin gets the blindfold taken off from his doctor, he sees that Davey is white, and it's I think it avoids the heavy-handedness of it by reversing the situation, to show that everyone can have their biases. What from the later couple of seasons do you think were some of the standout episodes?
Again, I can't speak to that. What I can say is think about what was going on in the early 1970s. Yeah. The Lutheran Church in America at the time and the ALC and Missouri too, were recognizing that Americans were moving into the city, that they were leaving the farms, and the farms were the rural areas where the the foundation of Lutheranism in America. They were immigrant farmers, most of them, and people were now moving to the cities, and these urban problems were really affecting urban congregations. So issues like fair housing, issues like race relations, um, people with disabilities. I know Davey addressed that as well. That became that wasn't necessarily a thing prior to those times, but by the environment, the whole Earth Day and ecology movement gets going in the early 1970s, and Davey addresses that. So it was just another effort by the church to try to be relevant to the times.
Yeah, and one of his friends, his new friends in the later episodes, it turns out that he doesn't have a father. His father died, so he's just living with his mother, and he covers up the fact because he's ashamed that he doesn't have a dad. And so Davey's father, Davey lets him share his dad for the episode, which again is a simple moral tale, but it somehow works. I think it probably would not have worked. It probably would have been a little too saccharine if it had been, say, on the Brady Bunch with live actors. But I think because you're using dolls and it's not quite reality, I think it's easier to sort of put these messages in and not be so obvious.
I couldn't agree more. If Davey was in production today and Art were alive today and Marshall Strauss was here, I think they would be talking about LGBTQ issues. They would be talking about transgender issues.
Yeah.
They would be talking about life in Gaza.
Yeah, I was just going to say. Yeah. One other episode I want to talk about before we talk a couple of other things. There's an episode, Kumbaya, and I remember that episode because when I was a boy, and that episode, according to Wikipedia, aired in November '72, so I would have been about 7. And I remember that because it was the words of an African song of praise to, I don't know if it was to the Jehovah, the Christian God, or to their God, but it was adopted. And I remember my church and all Lutheran churches in the area were told, this coming week there's going to be an episode about this, and we started incorporating that into my church to sing Kumbaya. And so it was, I guess, the one episode that in my mind sticks as them, the church leadership saying, we've got to watch this episode, because I think there was a Lutheran-wide effort to include this black hymn into the canon.
Well, and the global church, the German Lutheran Church and the Scandinavian Church was very active in missionary work in sub-Saharan Africa throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. And by the time of Davey and Goliath, the European colonial powers had withdrawn from much of sub-Saharan Africa, and these new national governments in places like Tanzania, I can think of most notably, there were a lot of Lutherans, right? And so the American Lutheran Church began to, it got to the point where there were far more Lutherans globally than there were in the global South than there were in Europe and the United States, and it's still that way today.
Well, I think, wasn't Namibia then South?
Oh my gosh, Namibia.
Yeah.
Well, that was during the 1980s. The Lutheran Church helped move Namibia from apartheid to statehood nonviolently. Very, very involved. Large Lutheran presence in Namibia. Again, German, colonial heritage, but it left a lot of African Lutherans, and it's still that way today. And so Davey and Goliath, again, was reflecting that global experience and trying to tweak the narrative from a Eurocentric religion to a global church. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I mean, if you think about in your childhood, most of your hymns would have been from, European composers, obviously Bach and Mendelssohn and so on and so forth. But now, as the 1970s and 80s, progressed, those global Lutheran churches began to really become present in the minds of American Lutherans. And so singing Kumbaya would have been followed by many other, African hymns and rhythms and so on that you would not have seen a generation before.
Yeah, speaking of these music, a few other trivia points that I wanted to bring up is that so the early Davies and the later Davies both use music composed by Luther himself. In the early episodes, you got a handful of trumpeters there, and then
Ein Festeborg.
yeah, and then in the later ones, you get a more slow jazzy version of it. It's like womp 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 womp. Or maybe I don't know. Was it a synthesizer we used? What significance did that particular song have to the show, and why was it changed a different version midway?
Well, the tune "A Mighty Fortress Is Our God" is attributed to Martin Luther. Yeah. He was a great hymn writer, and Yaroslav Pelikan, the theologian, said the Lutheran Church has produced two great theologians. Martin Luther and Johann Sebastian Bach. So Lutheran music is central to the core identity of Lutheranism. And so Luther himself wrote many hymns, but he took many of the tunes for the hymns that he wrote from pubs, from taverns. When he was imprisoned or hiding out in the Wartburg Castle, famous stories of him going down into the village to listen to Luther was not a commoner. He came from an emerging middle class, but he would go down and listen to how they spoke German, because the German language wasn't codified yet. It was kind of like English, it's hard for us to understand Old English. If you read it back, if you read, Chaucer or something, it's hard to understand. And German wasn't quite set yet. Luther translates the New Testament into German, something the Pope was not thrilled about. He said, translating the Bible will allow every man to carve his own path to hell. That was Leo X. But Luther translates it into English, and he then heard these tunes that people were singing in the bars as they drank beer and, sang their tunes, and he applied those to the hymns that he wrote. And one of those hymns, the one that's become most famous and most popular, is "A Mighty Fortress." I think, don't hold me to it, I seem to recall maybe a fight about that. Like they didn't want to use that song, and Marshall Strauss insisted on it, it was wise thing to do that, because it really struck a chord with, so to speak, with Lutherans.
As we've been talking about this, just as a side question, because you probably know a lot more about Lutheranism as a faith itself, Martin Luther himself has a reputation of being very anti-Semitic, the man himself, not the religion, and yet we've been talking about how progressive the church is. Has the Lutheran Church spent the last few centuries sort of distancing themselves from the man and going more towards his ideas rather than his actions?
Yes. Luther's a man of the 16th century. So I don't think today the ELCA, they have. The ELCA has signed a number of interfaith agreements acknowledging Luther's anti-Semitism, Luther's Islamophobia. Luther didn't like anybody that didn't agree with him. Yeah. So if you're a Calvinist, he was ready to toss you, because you differed with him about the sacraments. He was a pickle, man. He was a brilliant, extraordinary, vulnerable, fragile, incredibly courageous. He's a mix. He's so many different things. And particularly in his later years, he wrote things because the Germans were the thing that worried them the most, that freaked them out the most, was immigration. Yeah. The Turks, they were at the door of Vienna, and everyone was, freaked out that the Turks were going to come and destroy Germany. And so he wrote about that, and unfortunately some of those things are they're just unfortunate. And I think all major Lutheran church bodies openly acknowledge that that's not the way that we see the world today.
One other question before I get back to the Davey and Goliath thing. You mentioned that you are from what, Chicago? Chicago?
Yes, a Lombard.
Yeah, because I grew up in New York. I then lived for about a dozen years in the Twin Cities, and now I'm down in Texas, not far from a town called Fredericksburg, which is a big German town in
Oh yeah, those Lutherans on the Brazos.
Yeah, but it's interesting because there's different types of German immigrant families that have come to each of the places. In New York City, my mom and dad spoke German and Yiddish fluently, and people would say, "Why are Germans speaking Yiddish? That's Jewish." And we'd be, "No, that's basically gutter German. I think 80% of Yiddish is actually with the sh, with the German, the sh sound." Did Germans in the Midwest, Chicago area, were they also speaking Yiddish, or was it just harder German? Or
no, it's a different immigration pattern. So. Yeah. The Germans on the East Coast tend to come along with Henry Mielke or Muhlenberg in the 17th and 18th centuries, and then a whole new wave of Germans with the rise of the Prussian state and the Franco-Prussian War come in a different wave for different reasons, and they came to different places. Most of your folks in I'm not a demographer, but most of the Germans in Texas came up the Mississippi from New Orleans, right? But your folks in New York, they came through Philadelphia and so on and so forth.
So Davey and his family are known as the Hansons. So that's a very Nordic background. I don't know if we're ever told if Davey and his family are Germans or Swedes or.
I wish we could ask Marshall that question. I don't know the answer. Eric might.
Yeah. Now, I want to talk about the title of the show is Davey and Goliath, which is obviously the David and Goliath myth, the young boy King David who slays the 10-foot tall giant, or however the hell tall Goliath was supposed to be. And it's interesting, though, because the Goliath in this show, 9 times out of 10 acts as Davey's conscience. And in later years, you sometimes you can find online some very salacious spoofs where it's like the Son of Sam killer David Berkowitz in the 70s. A little boy talking to his dog who has him do crazy things. But was there a reason that they chose Davey and Goliath rather than Daniel and his pet lion or something?
I don't know. Did you watch the A Gift to Children? It's the piece we did for Mosaic, Davey and Goliath, A Gift to Children. By the way, YouTube, it's just funny, 2 days ago I got a message from YouTube, they blocked it.
Oh.
It's been up for years, and somebody got their undies in a bundle, and when that happens, you don't have any recourse.
Yeah.
It's just gone. There was probably some music track in the original show that somebody didn't like.
But we don't know. Do we know why the Clokey? Was it Clokey who chose that, or was it the church who chose the title?
Oh, I'm sure Marshall chose it. I'm sure the church chose it.
Okay. Because, like I said, it is an interesting inversion that you have the hero and the adversary, and the adversary now becomes the better part of the hero in this little boy. And as I mentioned, there was a lot of parodies about it. Let's talk, though, about the legacy, but the legacy in 2 aspects. One,
I put a link to the Mosaic piece we did.
Okay.
And I think that might answer some of your questions, because that's got Marshall's interview in there, and it's a primary source as opposed to me, which is clearly a secondary source.
Yeah. I'll take a look at that later today. So I wanted to look at the legacy of the show from 2 aspects. One, from the technical aspects, Clokey going from Gumby to Davey, And this is, I guess, in the same vein as the Rankin Bass stuff, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer and that kind of stuff. So what is the legacy of the show technically, and then what is the legacy of the show to the greater culture? As I had said, it within a small stream, people still remember it who grew up with it and who probably are Lutherans, but it doesn't seem to have aged as well as one might hope it would have. So what is the technical and both and the religious or the societal legacies of the show?
Well, I think technically in our digital age, there's this is just my opinion, but there is a recognition on the part of modern audiences when you watch Davey and Goliath to respond favorably to Davey because it's real. Like it's physically a physical puppet.
Yeah.
It's shot physically on 16 millimeter film, right? So light exposes the film. It's a chemical process. There's nothing about it that's digital. You're seeing something that's real. Mm-hmm. So the depth of field from the the puppet to the background is a real. It's not digitally contrived. And I think at some subliminal level, audiences today of the digital age just respond to it because it's real. And people do respond. It still is very popular and run on stations all over the place. Independent stations still run Davey. I don't know what the list is anymore. We used to keep track of it, but that was years ago. So that's on the technical piece. I think because it's real, people resonate with it. In terms of the legacy on a more spiritual level, I think it's the message of the gospel. That's just, love your neighbor as yourself, and that is a universal message that translates to any religion, any epic. Anybody can understand that, and Davey drives that home again and again and again and again, and that's why people continue to resonate with it today.
You mentioned about 20 years ago there was an attempt at a revival. I know, was it Mountain Dew? One of the big soda companies sponsored it. Did the sponsorship just fall through? And is there any hopes in the future of reviving and having new episodes for the 21st century?
I'm going to defer that question to Eric Schaefer because that was his purview. I did one story on Davey in 1995, and it got for Mosaic, and it was a very popular episode, that A Gift to Children, Davey and Goliath. And a few years after that, there was conversations above my head about doing a revival. A lot of work went into it. A lot of time and resources went into it. And they, as you say, the Mountain Dew commercial was produced. There was other factors that Saturday Night Live, and Eddie Murphy did the parody of Gumby.
Yeah.
And so it was just, it was the late 90s and early 2000s. There was a lot of retro, appeal. People were reflecting back at that period of time, and it was just the right time to try to do something, and they did. They got Snowboard Christmas done. It was a big deal. It took a lot of time. It was all outside. I had nothing to do with it. And they produced Snowboard Christmas. It got, it did well. It was just the fact that they were able to produce it, I thought, was a monumental achievement, because they didn't have the ELCA didn't have the kind of resources that the LCA had in the 1950s. Much bigger Lutheran church in the 1950s. A lot, based in New York. Lots of connections with the arts world and so on. Also, I mentioned too, as an aside, when they were doing Davey, the Lutheran Church in America backed, along with the Aid Association for Lutherans and what became Thrivent, the insurance company. They backed a feature film called Martin Luther, which won an Academy Award. So you can Google that. It's the 1950s. It's really good.
Yeah.
Really well done.
Is it a
And so
documentary
no, it's a feature film.
Okay.
It's a feature film. And about the time that they were doing Snowboard Christmas, they did another feature film, a new adaptation with Fiennes, not Ralph Fiennes' brother.
I know.
So
who
Ralph,
you mean.
yeah, Ralph Fiennes' brother was Luther. He did a terrific job. It had, he was Peter Ustinov in it. So they've done a couple of retakes of the Luther film, and both of those productions, feature films, coincide with the production of the original Davey and Goliath and the Snowboard Christmas that was done in the early 2000s. In other words, it was just the time. The time was right. These seem to go in curves.
So my final question then is, what is your favorite, or what do you think is the best episode of Davey and Goliath? And if you have 2 or 3 you want to mention, that's fine. And is there anything else you'd like to add?
Well, I think the Easter episode is the best one in my view, because Davey loses his grandmother and he's got to deal with grief. And
that's like a 30-minute episode, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it was a special. Yeah. And it was just beautiful and well done, and I tear up every time I watch it. It just embodies Lutheran theology in a beautiful, simple message that there's hope. There's and that hope springs eternal.
Well, Tim Frakes, thank you for spending almost an hour talking about this old show. I will link to your production website below this video for anyone who wants to find out more about you. But thank you for talking about Davey and Goliath.
You're welcome.